Hey everybody, how's it going? Today I'm starting the video off at 3 a.m. on the day of its release because, as you may know, I took a week off to work on rewriting the code, cleaning it up, and making it work better. The code got to a point where it was unreadable, and that's something that should never happen because once you lose control of the code and you start throwing random things on it hoping it'll work, you're not going to get very far. Now, I've learned a few things since the last time I posted a video. The first thing was that I had written my sprite and my world, my room class, as separate objects. That was a major mistake because your sprite, when it is searching for boundaries, cannot see any of the tiles of a room that is a completely different scope. So if you exist in the world, you are a child of the world in that hierarchy, and you can physically touch and see other things in the world because you are a sibling to them. Well, in this case, this guy right here existed in an entirely different universe from the room itself. It was a huge oversight on my part, but now I've already done a little bit of testing as to how I can correct that, and I've posted some threads on Reddit, and I've received some excellent advice, a couple of resources on writing game engines, and big thanks to all the users who helped me out on that. And today I'm going to show you a bit of the rewrite as a way of saving my skin, considering that I made next to no progress. Maybe that's not true. I actually did make a lot of progress, because when you compare this code to the original code, it's entirely different. If I could give an example, it's like learning how to do a new math formula or learning how to draw a new object on a piece of physical paper. The first few times you do it, you make several mistakes, you rewrite things, and the eraser marks don't go away. The paper gets nasty, and even if it works after the fact, it's damn near unreadable. This rewriting code is helpful because it gets rid of all those eraser marks, it gets rid of all the rips on the paper, the eraser shavings, the lead that didn't get erased, and it makes it so much easier to understand with fewer mistakes, and on top of that, repetition is improvement. So doing the same thing over and over again, you eventually learn better ways to do it. And today I'm going to show you some of the things that I've learned. Now, to open up the editor again, let's look at main.cs. I'm looking for something that I've changed. Well, for example, one thing that I've changed is I've changed the room object to be called a scene instead. I simply deemed that more fitting. The current scene is used by the main file. It's not really applicable to anything other than the overarching system, just to tell it this is the current scene and update the current scene. This way you can change the scene from the main file, which I'm probably going to regret later on if I write that. Base resize is something that I created so that I don't have to type resize equals 3 for every single object. I'm probably going to rework this once I create a camera object because of a bug that I discovered that I will cover in just a bit. Screen width and screen height were originally written as hard-coded variables. Now they are a get object, which is a lot easier because I just call them and it calls this code to return this. Let's go to the declaration of living room. So I've renamed tileset to sprite sheet just to keep consistency. I wasn't able to set it up to where tiles and scenes would be labeled with a tile set instead of a sprite sheet, while still keeping sprite as a superset of tile. My explanations sound very weird to me right now. Hopefully they come out and make a little bit of sense. The layout is now pretty much the same. The only difference is that these decimal points here originally did not move or resize with the actual base resize variable, wherever it is, right here. They stayed as a single pixel. So for example, if I had a tile that had a boundary on the left side that was 3 pixels wide and I scaled that tile up, that boundary should now be 9 pixels wide, but it was staying as 3 because I forgot to resize it. Now that is handled. I've changed centered to is centered, and that's just a nomenclature change. I've changed the offset function such that you no longer have to take into account whether or not it is centered when you call this function. You simply have to worry about the actual parameters, so screen width and screen height divided by 2. Now this is the first big change, and this is a change in progress right now. I haven't fully worked out the logic of how I want to go about this, but current scene.actors.add an object that's referred to as player, and that object is a new sprite with a sprite sheet, position, size. Base resize is the resize variable, is centered. The column count is, of course, the sprite sheet. Speed is now 100, and currently speed is based on the size of your game, your resize variable. That is a dependency that I have to get rid of, and the hitbox size is pretty much the same. Then I've set this up so player is equal to casting to a sprite, the current scene.actors player. That's simply saying take this object I created in this parent object and make it a known variable in the main file. I set up the idle animation, the walk animations, of course, nothing's really changed there, just the spacing. And then as a test, I have set the animation to walk down. I set up a debug texture. This is just a basic green texture that gets drawn whenever I want to see where a boundary or a hitbox is. I've created a key handler object. This is a basic wrapper class that checks for key input and handles it. It comes with a few functions such as key down. Well, let me just show you. Get state, this returns a keyboard state. It simply gets the previous and sets it to the current. It gets the current and sets it to, well, an updated version of itself, and then it returns the current key state. It has a get, and it takes a key argument, and it returns whether or not that key is down. There's a function called key pressed, and that returns whether or not the key was just pressed. There's a function called key released. It does the opposite and returns whether or not that key was recently released. And then there's an update function. I used this to cover up the code that handled the direction list in the original video. I believe it was part 2 where this was handled. Let me check in sprite.cs. This code right here. This code here did 2 things. First of all, it set the animation to where, depending on which key you were holding, it would play the appropriate animation. Therefore, if you were holding W, it would run the up animation. If you were holding S and so on and so forth, it would also run the move command. And this was very sloppy. If you look at this, I watched back that clip of myself explaining how this works, and it was probably one of the worst explanations I've ever heard in my entire life. This code should not be doing as much as it is. One general rule for programming is that there should be one way to do everything, and one way only. That's why we have strongly typed languages in the first place, is so that there is one way to do things correctly, and you can reliably check that against a known system. But this code does not apply to that. This code does, or at least it does better. I wish that I had taken some time to write a function to handle this without all this repetition. There's a programming rule. It's try to write dry code. Oh, well, that's annoying. Dry code. Don't repeat yourself. This is not dry, but there are a few variables in each of these that need to be taken into account. Since it's the same formula, I only spaced out the first iteration of this code, and then the rest of it for A, S, and D, I just kind of slapped it on there and said fuck it. So if get keys.w, so if W is being held down and not S, and neither A nor D being held together. How would I even say that? It's kind of a grammatical issue, to be honest. If W and not S, and parentheses not A and D at the same time, then check if up is in the list and then add up to the directions. That's a very confusing little statement right there. I mean, when you actually look at it, it makes sense, but that's why it's on a different line. Theoretically, I mean, in practice you could write it like this, but this is shit. This is awful. It would be much better to have it spaced out to where this is one condition. Well, this is the main condition. This is one restriction, and then this is another restriction. So if I wanted to clean this up, I could do something like that. If W and not S and not A plus D. However, I'm being extremely long-winded about this. Else, if it contains up, remove it. That checks whether or not it's having a conflict, or if it's just not being held in general. That's basically what the key handler does right there. Now, keep in mind, this does not animate the player, and it also doesn't tell the player anything. This right here simply acknowledges this key input and puts it in a writable fashion in keyhandler.directions. Now, back to the main scene here. Keyhandler.update, player.update game time, and keyhandler. This is the magic part right here. Then I have livingroom.draw, player.draw, of course. I have a draw boundaries function right here, which is disclosed right here. I will go over that in just a second. I'm going to move on now to the sprite and the tile objects. The tile object has been massively reworked to where everything that was originally public, most of it is now protected. And that's so that certain properties are not readily accessible from everything else. It's just a way of making sure that what you want to access is accessible, but things that are lower level, such as this interarray, collision bounds, these protected things are not accessible. It's unnecessary access. So I've done the same thing with some of the naming conventions here, is centered, is boundary. I also realized a couple of issues here. This is something that I'm working on. This all goes back to that bug that I mentioned earlier. Getting the rectangle here, somewhere information is being lost. Here, I'll just go ahead and show you what's going on here. So I'm running. Hopefully it'll decide to run today. Okay, so I'm back in the state. I've removed the code that tells him to actually go somewhere. So right now it just plays the animation. Now, let me enable this code to draw boundaries. So you can see he has a hitbox in green behind him so that I can see whether or not it's wider than or thinner than him. I've set his hitbox size to be a centered rectangle that is dependent on his actual sprite size. You know, not every sprite is a perfect square. And then these boundaries here go around the room. These are determined and set when you call this code here. So this goes in a clockwise fashion. It sets the top 3. Well, going by tile, this top left corner is top, no right, no bottom, and left. This is top, nothing else, top, nothing else, top, right, nothing else, nothing else. If that makes sense. It's a 3x3. No, it's 4x4. I'm pretty sure you get the point. The problem I'm experiencing is this. You can see how everything is lined up. That probably gives away the issue. But if I go in here and I change the base resize to anything else, it all goes off center. And the thing that's bothering me the most is that it doesn't appear to be by a full tile. It appears to be some strange decimal amount. If I put him at his base size, his actual 32 by 32 pixels size, it gets even more off. Now let's go to 4. Now it's off in the other direction. And it appears that the boundaries, oh wait, this is a moment where I can potentially figure out what I need to fix. The boundaries are staying in place. They are staying in the correct location. At least they are with 4. Let's try 2 again. Those boundaries look centered. 1. Those boundaries look centered. 12. Yeah, it's definitely centered. So the boundaries are in the right place. The boundaries are in fact in the right place. It's just everything else. Perfect. So that's the issue I'm experiencing there. But let's go back. I thought this was a pretty cool thing that I discovered. It's a little different than I expected it to be. Coming from Python and list comprehensions, doing this whole from item in collision bounds, select item times this dot resize dot to array of ints, that was a little foreign to me, but now that I understand what's going on here, it's actually pretty nice. That is just simply saying if collision bounds is null, which it is by default, meaning you never set up any collision bounds, then set collision bounds equal to a new int array of 4 zeros. Otherwise, if it is not null, and then set it to from item in collision bounds, select item times this dot resize times to array. It's not a mouthful. Now, the get sprite function, it's pretty much the same. Now, set boundaries has changed a little bit. If it's not a boundary, return a new dictionary that's empty. Now, set up a dictionary called boundaries and say, if collision bounds at 0 is not equal to 0, then add that boundary. Then, if the collision bounds at 1 is not equal to 0, add that boundary. So basically, any boundary that is 0 is ignored, and return boundaries. And there's the update function. It looks cleaner because it is I simply moved some things around, and I, partly from my own research and partly from Reddit, learned that the casting is a thing. Now, boundaries is equal to set boundaries, collision bounds. So you pass collision bounds to right here. Collision bounds is set up. It kept telling me that this name could be simplified, and now I don't know the difference between this dot collision bounds and just plain collision bounds. I'm going to look further into why you would not need to say this dot collision bounds. It was saying you don't need to say this dot anything, basically. It kept saying name can be simplified. So I'm not sure why. I'm pretty sure that it was simply a warning, I believe, but it was confusing. Either way, there's the draw function here. It's pretty simple, to be honest, but this is actually where I may have to come back to see what I can do to make sure it actually draws correctly, since the boundaries appear to stay in the center perfectly. Now, let's close up that region and look at the sprite. I can get rid of this, because this was a test that failed entirely. It was not something that was smart to do. Speed multiplier, facing, hitbox size. I'm looking for things that I changed recently to see if they're any better. I redesigned the layout of the animations dictionary because it was gross before. Now it looks a little more clear what this is actually saying. It's just saying add a new animation called default with a new tuple of an integer array and an integer. It's just a new integer array with 0 and 1. It's a little cleaner, but I would really love to see some kind of way to clean up this syntax to where it's not... I want it to be minified, but I don't want it to look like... I don't want it to look like that. These two things here are public. Oh, and again, most things became private. Now, I set the base speed to 60. Again, this has to be reworked based on the size of the sprite. Not entirely sure what I want to do about that yet. I set facing to down automatically. Speed multiplier is just set to 1. Directions is not much has changed there. Oh, this is something that I learned, is that you don't have to say if not hitbox size is equal to vector 2 or new vector 2 or something like that. You can say default of that object. That was a very pleasing thing to discover. Current animation is equal to animations default. That's why we added that one up there, so that it doesn't say animations doesn't exist and frame is equal to 0 by default. Now it comes through set hitbox, simply returns that, and it multiplies it by resize. Very simple. Add animation doesn't do anything different. Set animation has not been changed. Get collision is currently return true. The move function is something that got changed pretty heftily. Now it takes a game time variable and a key handler. These comments basically explain everything. The speed is multiplied if shift is held, and then it gets reset. Otherwise, it gets skipped entirely. I love that this line of code here can be skipped entirely if these conditions aren't met. The simplest condition is just if you are holding shift. Otherwise, skip this entire bit of code. You don't want to overuse if statements, but they can speed up and optimize things. Also, if you know programming, I know that it may have crossed your mind that I'm doing premature optimization. I want to make you aware I'm trying to avoid premature optimization. It's really difficult being a perfectionist like this. It sucks because I'm trying to think, but the game's gonna run slow. I'm doing my best to avoid that kind of stuff, but little things here and there never hurt anybody. Directions is equal to key handler dot directions. That's why I set it up to be handled here. That's why I set that up like that. This can see the key handler. The key handler cannot see the sprite. The primary direction. This is something that I've done differently. I set the primary direction variable to just be the first item in the list of directions. And then otherwise, the primary direction is what you are facing right now, which is defaulted to down. Float movement speed is equal to speed times float game time elapsed time total seconds times speed multiplier. So if this gets skipped entirely, then speed multiplier is 1, and if it gets set, then speed multiplier is equal to 2. Of course, I can change that or make it an accessible variable so that people can make their sprite run 12 million times faster if you're holding shift or something like that. If the sprite is not moving, then set its animation to idle facing. That was a lot easier than it used to be. That's just saying if the count of directions being held is 0, then set it to idle facing. Very proud of this little line of code right here. If the sprite is moving, move and animate along facing. I'm even proud of this comment here. If it's not moving, then do this, else it is moving. So if direction contains up, then next position dot y is minus or equal to movement speed, next position dot y and x. These are the variables right now that are preventing him from moving. When I said that I removed that code that caused him to move, I kind of lied. I didn't really think about what I was saying. I just set it to where he doesn't actually move. There is a little point on him that is checking whether or not something is a boundary. It's supposed to be, at least in due time. It will be checking to make sure that it is not running into a boundary. This is how I'm going to handle collisions. I'm going to check ahead of time on a temporary variable, next position, whether or not he's going to run into something and then stop him from moving entirely. Well, in that direction. It's simple things that people on Reddit have suggested, such as only looking at adjacent tiles, so 1, 2, 3, 4. Since diagonal movement is going to be a thing in this game, I'm going to have to do octidirectional, 8-directional. I like the sound of octidirectional, but I don't think that's a word. I'm going to have to calculate 8 tiles around him to check for collisions. I mean, that's really the easy way to say it. Facing is equal to primary direction, then set animation walk facing. It's really so much cleaner than it used to be. I mean, need I remind you, this is what that used to look like. This. I'm motioning with my hand to the screen. Like the what are those, or the boy kind of hand gesture towards my screen, because this is disgusting. This is sexy. Now, the update function just says if any of the keys that handle walking are being held, then run the move function. I used to have this thing like move stop or something like that. Yeah, move time and stop, set animation idle facing. There should be no such thing as move stop. There should just be a thing that says don't move. And that's this. Handle animation, let's open this up. This is just the timing for the frames and looping through. The frame source is here, frame output is here, the hitbox is here. This is a new rectangle which consists of this rectangle, like the actual rectangle property of the sprite object, .x, plus the width of itself divided by 2, and minus the integer casting of the hitbox size .x divided by 2. I love explaining things because it doesn't make sense at all, even to me. But this is how coding is for somebody of my level of experience, at least in this language. I mean, hell, if you handed me some Python, I could probably throw down with that, but oh god, this is a whole different beast for me. Then there's the draw function, of course. Now let's move on to something interesting, the scene object. This is just a big list of tiles. It's just a square of tiles. It doesn't have any coordinate relationship to the world itself, the actual black screen. So when I run this little sprite right here, the actual set that makes the floor, does not know where it is. All it knows is that it was created with its origin about the center, so it was kind of like a quarter of it showing right here, and then I just shifted it by half the screen width and half the screen height, and it has no idea how much black space is around it until I calculate that using some kind of function. This is something that I'm considering changing. I mean, as a matter of fact, I'm considering not offsetting the world at all, because I'm going to have a camera that follows this. It's a bunch of things that should have been taken into consideration before I even started writing these, but I was a dumb and I didn't. So now I'm just living with the repercussions of that and taking a week off of a video and recording it on the day of its posting. I'm going to have to edit this too. Lovely. I started this series trying to write subtitles for every video, and then I realized that writing subtitles is a soul-crushing process, and I would rather pay for it than do it myself. But I'm not going to pay for it because I'm a perfectionist, and unless I know that somebody can write subtitles the way that I intend them to be written, I'm not going to do it. I'll probably take some time to just write subtitles for a little while, but that will be a project for another day. Now, let's take a look at this. Return the pixel width of the full tile map. This is how I get the width. I get layout.orderBy x, where x.length. Well, I'm not actually sure how to read that out loud. Not gonna lie, this is copy pasting code. I need to go deeper into the order by function and understand exactly how it works. Note to Microsoft and Visual Studio or anybody ever, this is not beginner friendly. And when we're trying in today's time to show that coding is not that difficult, this is disgusting. There needs to be some kind of way. I mean, hell, even Blender 3D software has a little note underneath it that says in simpler terms what something does. If Blender is ahead of the game and they started with right-click select, this is unacceptable, in my opinion. There's not even an example of how to actually use it. Okay, now I'm gonna defend Blender a little bit here. I am actually in support of right-clicking unsubscribe if you hate me for that, but right-click select forever. Now, same thing for the height, and then we go in and we set up two lists. Well, one list, one dictionary. Tiles is a list of a tile. We've seen that before. Actors is the new thing here. It's a dictionary of a string and an object, because you're going to be able to name every actor. In fact, you will be required to name every actor. You cannot just have that as your name. You can't have an NPC without a name. Or at least I'm intending not to have it that way. No small parts, only small actors. Call string. Oh yeah, I did do a bunch of rewriting here actually. This is a lot cleaner than it used to be. So I get a string version of the column by formatting the string. Basically, I'm going through every one of these and saying don't get rid of the fucking decimal points, you cunt. Do not get rid of those. I need those. That's what it says there. It says that verbatim. Then I get all the decimal points as a string. Pretty self-explanatory. Actually, I hate when people say that. I need to stop saying that. When people talk about some kind of code and like, I don't know what they're talking about. This is for the beginners. I feel it for you. When somebody says pretty self-explanatory, but this isn't a tutorial, so I'm not going to cover it. IsBoundary is equal to true by default because it's a tile, and I don't know why I said it's a true as default. I could have done the opposite, but I think it was just easier syntactically to do true or false instead of false or true. So get every decimal point as a string and then add them to a list. So set up a temporary little list called decimal points as strings, and a little for loop here as long as the decimal points are, and add that .toString to this list. And then test if all the decimal points are 0 by saying if decimal points as strings dot all x by x equals 0 IsBoundary equals false. Basically, if every single side of this thing is 0, then don't even worry about it. So this here, which has no decimal points here, it doesn't say 1, 2, 3, 4 after it. It's just 0. It's not a boundary. It's a filler tile. Array of integers called collision bounds with a lowercase c because this is a temporary one. From item in decimal points, select int32.parse item.toString.toArray integer empty parentheses. This may seem confusing, but it originally looked like this. Remember that thing I said earlier about dry? Like I said, that's not dry. We want our code to be dry. Don't repeat yourself. Now, setting this all up, this stuff was just a little simpler to declare and write, and then for each tile in tiles, tile.update. That's 1, 2, 3, 4 times that the letters TILE appear in sequence in that one line. Pretty proud of that. Offset has been made a little easier because I simply take the position at X and add the offset, and then I've got this ternary operator here. The ternary operator is basically just a one-line if statement that says test this condition. If it's true, do this, and if it's false, do this. That's how I read it, side to side like that. Then there's the draw function. For each tile in tiles, tile.draw sprite batch. Tiles don't really need anything extra. They don't need anything such as game time or key handler. If you have something that's interactive or has an event tied to it, I would honestly just make it a sprite. I wouldn't make it a tile. Tiles are just a graphical element that can be a boundary. So I guess that's really the rundown of everything here. If you made it through that, you're crazy, but I appreciate you're crazy. Things that I want to get done before I hang this little video up. Let me make a little notepad list. That's how you spell it. There we go. Realize that I only have a few hours to do all of this. Alright, we should be good now. Let's go ahead and get started. Hey everyone. After the time lapse, I basically crashed and went to sleep. I do not have a lot of time to get the rest of this code done, but I'll show you the progress that I've made. I lengthened the world by one tile so that I can actually test to see if it's going into the center. I know what I have to fix to get this into the center of the screen. It's in this line here. It's right here and right here. So when this section of when the length and the width of the map are even or odd, it gets offset by a different number. And this is something that I need to look into fixing. It's a little convoluted, but I was able to get a lot of stuff done in the way of fixing it. If I just remove this extra row here, I can show you what I mean. Oh, well, first of all, let's close that. And let's just grab that, copy paste it. This way it's even. There we go. Now he is in the middle again, and it is actually mathematically correct this time. This is changes to where he is. Right now he is centered. Pardon my phone. He is centered right now, and then when I set it to false, he is not centered, but his top left point is in the center. And then I can, of course, change his hitbox size back to what it used to be. Again, pardon my phone.